The evening sky was turning gold when Richard Carter's private jet landed earlier than expected. The world knew him as a powerful millionaire, but inside, he was a lonely man. Years of chasing money had built his empire but broke his home. His wife was gone, and his 10-year-old son, Ethan, was growing up like a stranger. Richard had planned to return on the weekend, but something inside him told him to go home early that Friday. He didn't tell anyone. Maybe he just wanted to surprise his son. Maybe he was tired of hotel rooms and empty dinners. He wanted to feel like a father again, even if for a night. As his car drove through the long driveway of his mansion, the huge iron gates opened silently. The place looked peaceful, too peaceful. The lights in the garden were dim, and no guards were in sight. He frowned. His staff was usually alert. He walked through the front door quietly, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The housemaid, Grace, always kept the place spotless, yet something felt off tonight. It wasn't the silence, it was the kind of silence that hides something. Richard dropped his suitcase and loosened his tie. From the hallway, he could see faint light under Ethan's bedroom door upstairs. A soft sound floated through the house, laughter. Not just any laughter. It was his son's. For a moment, Richard smiled. It had been weeks since he last heard that sound. But then, there was another voice. A woman's voice. Gentle, emotional. Grace. The maid. He paused, curious. What were they doing at this hour? Grace was supposed to be off duty after dinner. Slowly, Richard walked up the stairs, careful not to make any sound. As he reached the door, he heard Grace whispering softly. "You're just like your mother," she said, her voice trembling. Kind, and too forgiving. Richard froze. His wife. It had been years since anyone in the house dared to mention her name. He stepped closer, listening. Ethan's small voice replied, "Did you know my mom, Grace? Dad never talks about her." There was a long silence. Richard's heartbeat quickened. "I knew her better than you think," Grace finally said. Her tone was heavy, almost sad. "She was a beautiful soul. She loved you very much, and she loved your father too, even when he forgot to love himself." Richard's chest tightened. What did that mean? He took another step closer, now standing right outside the door. He could see a small gap, enough to peek inside. Grace was sitting on Ethan's bed, her hand gently stroking his hair. Ethan looked at her like a child looks at someone he trusts completely. Grace wasn't wearing her uniform, just a plain white shirt and jeans. Her eyes were red, like she had been crying. "Grace," Ethan whispered, "how did my mom die?" Richard felt a sharp pain in his chest. He had never told Ethan the full story. He had said it was an accident, a car crash. But there was more. Much more. And he had buried that truth deep inside, hoping time would erase it. Grace's lips trembled. "It was an accident, sweetheart, but not the kind you think." Richard's breath caught. What was she saying? Ethan looked confused. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated. Tears filled her eyes. "Sometimes, accidents happen because of the choices people make. Your mother was trying to protect someone she loved." Richard's pulse raced. He wanted to burst in, demand answers, but something held him back. He couldn't move. He just stood there, frozen between guilt and fear. Ethan yawned, curling up under his blanket. "You talk like you were there," he said sleepily. Grace brushed his hair back and smiled sadly. "Maybe I was," she whispered. Those 3 words hit Richard like a knife. Maybe I was. He clenched his fists. What was she hiding? Why did she know so much about that night? And why was she talking to Ethan about it? He had hired Grace 5 years ago through an agency. She was quiet, responsible, and good with children. But she had always been a little guarded. Now, for the first time, Richard saw something different, a woman with secrets. Grace leaned down and kissed Ethan's forehead. "Sleep, little one. Tomorrow will be a better day." She turned off the lamp and quietly walked toward the door. Richard quickly stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. His heart was pounding. As Grace opened the door, she paused. For a second, it felt like she could sense him standing there. Her eyes glanced toward the darkness, but she said nothing. She walked past him, silent, her face pale and unreadable. Richard waited until she disappeared down the stairs. Then he pushed the door open and looked at his sleeping son. Ethan's small face was peaceful. But Richard's mind was a storm. What did Grace mean? Why would she say she was there? Was she lying to his son, or had she really been part of that night? He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the old family photo on the nightstand, him, Anna, and baby Ethan. His wife's smile seemed to look right through him, the same way it did years ago when she said, "One day, your money won't be enough." He sighed deeply, rubbing his face with his hands. "What are you hiding from me, Grace?" he whispered. Downstairs, a door creaked. Grace was in the kitchen, her shadow moving across the light. She opened a small box from her apron and took out something shiny, a golden locket. She opened it and looked inside, her eyes filling with tears. Inside was a photo of Anna and a baby. Grace whispered, "I promised I'd protect him. I won't break that promise now." She closed the locket tightly and wiped her tears away. Upstairs, Richard stood at the window, watching the rain begin to fall. He didn't know it yet, but the truth hiding in his house was about to change his life forever. And the night he came home early was only the beginning. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently through the wide windows of the Carter mansion, but the warmth did nothing to ease Richard's restless mind. He hadn't slept all night. Every word Grace had said to his son echoed in his head, "Maybe I was." What did she mean by that? Was she really there the night Anna died? And why would she keep that secret for so long? Downstairs, he could hear the faint sound of dishes clinking. Grace was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Ethan's laughter drifted from the living room as he played with his toy car. It sounded innocent, too innocent for a house filled with unspoken truth. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, trying to act normal, but his chest felt heavy. He walked down the marble stairs slowly, his eyes fixed on the kitchen doorway. Grace turned as he entered, startled to see him awake so early. "Oh, Mr. Carter. You're home," she said quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. Her voice carried that same calm tone, but her eyes flickered with something else. "Worry, maybe." "I came home early," Richard said, watching her closely. "I thought I'd surprise my son." Grace smiled politely. "He was very happy to see you last night." "I'm sure," he said quietly, taking a seat at the dining table. "You two seem to talk a lot." She froze for a split second, then turned back to the stove. "He's a lonely child, sir. I just try to be there for him." Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "And do you always tell him stories about his mother?" Grace's hand trembled slightly as she picked up a plate. "Only when he asks." "And when he asked how she died," Richard said slowly, "what did you tell him?" The silence stretched thin like glass. Grace placed the plate on the table and met his eyes for the first time. "I told him what he deserves to know, Mr. Carter, the truth." "The truth?" Richard's voice hardened. "What truth could you possibly know that I don't?" She hesitated, lowering her gaze. "Some things are better left buried." "Buried?" He stood up now, his temper rising. "You think I haven't buried enough already?" Grace looked at him quietly, her face pale but calm. "Maybe that's the problem, sir. You buried your heart too." Her words cut deep. Richard wanted to shout, to demand answers, but Ethan's small footsteps came running toward them. "Dad! Grace! Look what I built!" Ethan held up a small Lego house, his eyes bright with pride. Grace quickly smiled, her voice gentle again. "That's wonderful, Ethan." Richard forced a smile, nodding. "That's amazing, son." For a moment, everything looked normal. A peaceful morning, a happy child, a caring maid. But beneath that thin surface, secrets were clawing their way up. After breakfast, Grace helped Ethan pack his school bag. Richard stood by the door, watching. The way she tied Ethan's shoelaces, brushed the dust off his shoulders, it reminded him of how Anna used to do the same. It made his chest ache. When Ethan left for school, the silence returned, heavier than before. Richard followed Grace into the hallway. "We're not done talking," he said firmly. Grace turned, her eyes tired. "Please, Mr. Carter." "Not now." He stepped closer. "You said you knew my wife." "How? From where?" Grace took a deep breath. "It's not my story to tell. It is if you were part of it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she stood her ground. Anna was a good woman. She didn't deserve what happened that night. Richard's voice dropped. "You talk like you were there." Grace swallowed hard. "Maybe I was closer to that night than you realize." He stared at her, speechless. She looked away, whispering, "Anna trusted me. She made me promise to protect Ethan, no matter what." Richard's throat went dry. "You worked for us before?" Grace didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her bag and started walking toward the back door. "Grace," he called out. "Don't walk away from me." She stopped, her hand on the door. "You've spent years running from your own guilt, Mr. Carter. Maybe it's time you stop chasing me and start facing it." And then she walked out, leaving him standing there in stunned silence. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Richard tried to focus on work calls and meetings, but his thoughts kept circling back to Grace's words. How could she have known Anna? How could she have been there the night of the accident? When evening came, Ethan returned home, full of excitement from school. "Dad, Grace said she might take me to the park tomorrow." "Can she?" Richard forced a smile. "We'll see, son." He didn't have the heart to tell Ethan that Grace might not come back. That night, unable to rest, Richard poured himself a glass of whiskey and went to his study. The large room smelled of old books and regret. He opened his late wife's photo album. In one of the pictures, a smiling young Anna at her baby shower, a familiar face stood behind her. A woman with kind eyes and brown hair tied in a bun. Grace. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. His heart pounded as he stared at the photo. She had been there all along. Grace wasn't just a maid. She was part of his past, part of the night that destroyed everything. Outside, thunder rolled through the dark sky. And Richard finally realized something he should have known years ago: the truth had been living under his own roof. Rain poured heavily against the mansion windows that night, matching the storm inside Richard's chest. The photo still lay on his desk, its edges wet with spilled whiskey. He couldn't take his eyes off it. Grace, smiling faintly, standing right behind Anna, years before she was ever hired as a maid. It wasn't possible. She had lied from the beginning. But why? He didn't wait for morning. His anger and confusion boiled together until he couldn't sit still. The clock struck midnight when he finally stood up, grabbed his coat, and marched toward the servants' quarters. His footsteps echoed through the long corridor, each one louder than the last. Grace's door was slightly open. A faint light flickered inside. He pushed it open without knocking. Grace looked up, startled. She was sitting at her small wooden desk, holding that same golden locket he had seen the night before. Her eyes widened when she saw him standing there. "Mr. Carter," she said softly. "It's late. We need to talk," he snapped, closing the door behind him. "Now." Grace set the locket down slowly. "Is something wrong?" Richard stepped closer, slamming the photograph onto her desk. "You tell me." She looked at it quietly, her face unreadable. "So you found it." "You were there," he shouted. "You were with Anna before she died. You lied to me for years, living in my house, taking care of my son, acting like a stranger." Grace stood up, her voice calm but trembling. "I didn't lie, Mr. Carter. I only kept a promise." "A promise?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "To who? To my wife? You expect me to believe that?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "To Anna." Her words silenced him for a moment. The rain outside thundered louder. "She made me promise to protect Ethan, and to keep her secret safe," Grace continued, tears filling her eyes. "She didn't want you to carry the guilt." Richard clenched his jaw. "Guilt for what? For loving her? For losing her?" Grace shook her head slowly. "For breaking her heart." He froze. "What are you talking about?" Grace took a deep breath, her voice shaking but firm. "Anna wasn't just my employer, Mr. Carter. She was my friend. Before you married her, she was kind, open, full of life. But after the company took off, you started to change. You stopped seeing her. You stopped listening. She tried to tell you she was lonely, but you were always too busy being important." Richard's throat tightened. He turned away, staring at the floor. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't lived with that every day?" Grace wiped her tears but continued, her words cutting deeper. "The night she died, she called me. She was scared, crying. She said she needed to get away for a while, to think. You two had fought that night, didn't you?" Richard's mind went blank for a moment. He remembered that night clearly, the argument, the slammed door, the car engine roaring away into the dark. He had told himself it was just anger, that she would come back. But she never did. His voice came out hoarse. "You were with her when she crashed?" Grace nodded slowly. "I followed her. She shouldn't have been driving that fast, not in the storm. I tried to stop her, but the car slipped off the road. I pulled her out, but," her voice cracked. "She was gone before the ambulance arrived." Richard staggered back, covering his mouth. No, that's not possible. The police report said she was alone." "I told them she was," Grace said quietly. "Anna made me promise not to tell anyone. She didn't want you to live the rest of your life hating yourself." He stared at her in disbelief. "You kept that secret for 10 years?" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I took the job here only to watch over Ethan. To make sure he grew up loved. I thought I could do it quietly, without reopening old wounds. But you came home early, and the truth couldn't stay hidden anymore." Richard's anger slowly faded, replaced by confusion and grief. He sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. "All these years, I blamed everyone but myself." Grace watched him silently, her heart breaking for the man who had everything but peace. "Sometimes, forgiveness takes longer than life itself," she said softly. He looked up at her, eyes red. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because you weren't ready to listen," she whispered. "And because I was afraid. You were powerful, angry, unreachable. I thought if I told you, you'd fire me and push Ethan away from me too. And I couldn't lose him. Not after what I promised Anna." The silence between them felt heavy, but it wasn't filled with hatred anymore, it was filled with truth. For the first time, Richard saw Grace not as a maid, but as a woman who had carried his wife's final burden all alone. After a long pause, he stood up and walked to the window. The rain had slowed, and the night had grown still. "You said Anna made you promise to protect Ethan," he said quietly. "Did she leave anything else? Anything for me?" Grace hesitated, then opened her drawer and pulled out a folded envelope, its paper old and slightly yellow. "She wrote this the night she left. I was told to give it to you when the time was right." Richard stared at the envelope like it was a ghost. His hand shook as he took it. "Why now?" he asked, his voice breaking. Grace met his eyes. "Because now, you're finally ready to read it." He looked at the letter for a long time, his heart pounding. Then he turned toward her again, his voice low. "Grace, I don't know if I can forgive myself." She stepped closer, her expression soft and full of sorrow. "Then start by forgiving her." At that moment, Ethan's sleepy voice came from the hallway. "Dad? Why are you and Grace awake?" Both turned sharply. Ethan stood in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. He looked small, fragile, innocent. Richard quickly hid the letter behind his back. "Nothing, son," Richard said gently. "Go back to bed." Ethan nodded slowly, but before leaving, he looked at Grace. "You're not leaving, right?" Grace smiled weakly. "Not tonight, sweetheart." When Ethan disappeared down the hall, Richard turned back to her. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "It's time I face the truth." But as he looked down at the letter in his trembling hand, he knew the truth might destroy what little peace he still had left. And somewhere deep inside, a new fear began to grow. What if the letter revealed something even worse than he imagined? The next morning came slow and gray, the kind of morning that carried the weight of things left unsaid. Richard sat in his study with the envelope resting on the desk before him. His fingers traced the edges again and again, afraid to open it, afraid of what waited inside. Grace's words from the night before echoed through his mind. She wrote this the night she left. It was strange how a simple piece of paper could feel heavier than all the millions he had earned. He had spent his whole life signing contracts, closing deals, building towers, yet here he was, paralyzed by one letter written in his wife's handwriting. He finally took a deep breath and opened it. The faint scent of perfume still clung to the paper, soft and familiar. Anna's handwriting was neat, graceful, just as he remembered. "Richard, if you are reading this, it means life didn't give us the chance to fix what was broken. I don't blame you for what happened between us. I know your heart was never cruel, only afraid. But there are truths you must face, not for me, but for our son. Ethan deserves to grow up knowing his mother loved him, and that his father was once capable of love too. I'm leaving tonight because I need space to breathe again. If I don't come back, please forgive me. And forgive yourself. Grace knows what I couldn't say. Trust her, even when it hurts. Anna." Richard's hands shook as he lowered the letter. His throat burned, his chest tight. The silence in the room felt like punishment. For years, he had blamed fate, the storm, even Anna's carelessness, but never himself. He pressed the letter to his forehead and closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have listened." A knock broke the silence. Grace stood at the door, her eyes calm but red from crying. "You read it," she said softly. Richard nodded, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't she come to me? Why did she have to leave that night?" Grace stepped closer. "Because she thought leaving would wake you up. She loved you, Mr. Carter. But love can't breathe when it's never seen." He turned toward the window, watching the rain that still clung to the glass. "All these years, I thought I lost her in that crash. But I lost her long before that, didn't I?" Grace didn't answer. She didn't need to. For a long time, they stood in silence until Richard spoke again. How did you find her that night? You said you followed her. Grace took a deep breath. She called me after your fight. I was already on my way to her house when I saw her car heading toward the bridge. The storm was bad, visibility was poor. I followed at a distance. When she lost control, I pulled over and ran to her. She was still breathing when I reached her. Richard turned sharply, eyes wide. She was alive? Grace nodded, tears forming. For a few minutes. She asked me to tell you she loved you, and she said not to let Ethan grow up with anger in his heart. His heart cracked open at those words. He sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. And you kept that inside you for 10 years? Grace's voice broke. I had to. The promise wasn't just about Ethan, it was about giving you a chance to live without drowning in guilt. Richard looked up at her, eyes wet. Grace, do you have any idea what this letter means? It changes everything. Grace nodded. Yes. That's why I kept it hidden. I wanted you to be ready when you found it. And now, maybe you are. He stared at her for a moment before asking, why did you really come back? Out of guilt? Or because of her? Grace hesitated, then smiled sadly. Because of Ethan. I couldn't let him grow up the way you did, alone, afraid to love. I saw Anna's eyes in his, and I knew I couldn't walk away. Richard exhaled slowly. You could have had your own life, Grace. She shook her head. This became my life. Anna trusted me with her son. I kept that promise the only way I knew how. Just then, the sound of small footsteps echoed from the hallway. Ethan peeked inside, holding a drawing in his hand. Dad, I made something for you. He ran over and handed the paper to Richard. It was a crayon drawing, a house with 3 figures, a man, a woman, and a child. Over it, Ethan had written, my family. Richard's voice trembled. Who's this? He asked softly, pointing at the woman. Ethan smiled proudly. That's Grace. She's part of our family too. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Richard looked at her, then back at the drawing, realizing how much she had done for his son, how much she had done for him. When Ethan left the room again, Richard stood and walked to the fireplace. He looked at the letter one last time, then carefully placed it back in the envelope. You kept your promise, Grace, he said quietly. You saved my son when I didn't even know he needed saving. Grace smiled faintly. You still have time, Mr. Carter. Don't waste it. He nodded, turning toward her. Where will you go now? She hesitated. I don't know. Maybe it's time I stopped living in the past. Richard frowned. You're leaving? Grace lowered her eyes. I think I should. You and Ethan deserve to rebuild without me in the middle. He wanted to protest, but the words wouldn't come. As she turned to leave, she placed the golden locket on his desk. Keep it, she said softly. It belongs with the letter. When the door closed behind her, the house felt colder than ever. Richard stood still, staring at the locket in his hand. Inside was the photo of Anna and baby Ethan, and now, he finally understood why Grace had held onto it all these years. He walked to the window and looked out into the gray morning, whispering, You were right, Anna. I wasn't ready then. But I am now. Yet deep down, a new fear crept in, that Grace's departure might cost him more than forgiveness. Because for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't just mourning his wife. He was afraid of losing the woman who had kept his family alive. The rain had stopped, but the world outside still looked heavy and gray, like it hadn't yet decided if it was ready for sunlight. Inside the mansion, everything felt quiet again, too quiet. Grace was gone. Her room was empty, her closet bare, her favorite mug missing from the kitchen shelf. It felt strange how a single person could leave such a hollow space behind. Richard stood in the doorway of her empty room, holding the golden locket she'd left him. The small object felt warm in his hand, almost alive. He opened it again, Anna's photo on one side, baby Ethan on the other. His fingers brushed over the worn metal as if trying to hold on to the past it carried. He thought about calling Grace, but he didn't know where she had gone. She had left no note, no forwarding address, nothing. For 2 days, the house stayed silent except for Ethan's questions. "Dad, where's Grace? Is she coming back? Did she do something wrong?" Each question cut a little deeper. Richard didn't know what to say. How could he explain to his son that the woman who had raised him was not just a maid, but the last living piece of his mother's story? Finally, on the 3rd morning, Richard made a decision. He found an old business card Grace had once used when she helped organize a charity drive in a nearby town. The address printed on it was a small church-run shelter about an hour away. He didn't think twice, he grabbed his keys and drove. The drive felt long, every passing mile filled with memories he didn't want to face. By the time he arrived, the sun had dipped low in the sky. The shelter stood at the edge of a small, quiet town, old brick walls, a white cross above the entrance, and the faint sound of children's laughter from the courtyard. Inside, the place smelled of bread and soap. Volunteers moved quietly between tables, serving food and folding clothes. And there, near the back, was Grace. She was kneeling beside a small boy, tying his shoes, her voice soft and kind, just as it had always been. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, her expression froze. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, standing quickly. "You shouldn't be here." "I had to see you," Richard said, stepping closer. "You left without saying goodbye." Grace looked down. "It was easier that way." "For you, maybe," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Not for Ethan. He misses you." Her eyes softened. "I miss him too." There was a long silence. The sounds of the shelter faded into the background. Finally, Richard spoke again. "You said Anna trusted you. You said she made you promise something. But there's still more, isn't there? Something you didn't tell me." Grace's hands trembled. "Why can't you let it rest, Mr. Carter? You have the letter. You know the truth." "No," he said quietly, shaking his head. "I know your truth. Not hers." Grace sighed deeply, closing her eyes for a moment. "Anna was pregnant," she whispered. "The night she died, she told me she was expecting another child." Richard's breath caught. What did you say?" "She found out the same day you two argued," Grace continued. "She wanted to tell you, but when she saw how angry you were, she couldn't. She left thinking she would come back the next morning. But fate didn't give her that chance." Richard staggered back, his hand gripping the nearest chair. "She was pregnant," his voice cracked. "And I never knew." Grace nodded slowly. "She planned to surprise you. She even asked me to help decorate the nursery." Tears filled Richard's eyes. He sank into the chair, covering his face. "I destroyed everything. My wife, my child, my family." Grace knelt beside him, her voice trembling but steady. "You didn't destroy them, Richard. You lost them because you forgot how to see them. Anna forgave you long before she left. But you have to forgive yourself now." He looked at her, tears sliding down his cheeks. "How do I forgive myself for killing hope?" She shook her head gently. "By keeping the one you still have, Ethan. He's your second chance. Don't make him grow up with the same emptiness you did." They sat there for a while, silent except for the sound of the rain starting again outside. Then Grace reached into her pocket and took out a small photograph. It was old and creased. She handed it to him. "This was taken a few days before the accident," she said softly. It showed Anna standing beside Grace, her hand resting on her stomach, her smile full of light. On the back, written in Anna's handwriting, were the words, "Forgive him, Grace. He doesn't know what he's losing." Richard's eyes blurred. He clutched the photo to his chest. "All these years, I thought you were just a maid," he whispered. "But you were the only person keeping her memory alive." Grace smiled weakly. "I didn't do it for me. I did it because I promised her I would." He looked at her long and hard. "And what about you? Who takes care of you, Grace?" She looked away, blinking back tears. "No one needs to. I've made my peace." Richard stood, his voice low but steady. "No, you haven't. You've been carrying everyone else's pain and never letting go of your own." For the first time, she didn't argue. She just looked at him, really looked, and for a brief second, the distance between them disappeared. Two broken souls, both bound by the same ghost. When Richard finally spoke again, his tone was different. Softer. Human. "Come back home, Grace. Not as a maid. As someone who belongs there." Her eyes widened. "Mr. Carter." "Richard," he said quietly. "Call me Richard." She hesitated, her lips trembling. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can," he said. "Because that's what Anna would have wanted." Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, washing the world clean. Grace looked at him, her heart heavy with everything she'd carried for a decade. And then, for the first time in 10 years, she nodded. "I'll come back," she whispered. "But only if you promise one thing." He looked at her. "Anything. Promise me you'll tell Ethan the truth, all of it." Richard took her hand gently. "I will. No more secrets." For the first time, there was peace in his voice. But deep down, neither of them knew that the truth, once told, would open a wound that love alone might not heal. Because some truths don't just set you free, they test if you're strong enough to stay that way. The next morning, the house felt strangely alive again. The smell of breakfast filled the air, and laughter echoed faintly through the hallways, something that hadn't happened in years. Grace was back. Not as a maid, not as a worker, but as a piece of the family that had always belonged. Yet, beneath the warmth, an invisible weight hung in the air. Both she and Richard knew what was coming, the truth. The one thing they could no longer hide. Ethan sat at the dining table, swinging his legs as he ate pancakes. He looked up, his bright eyes searching. "Dad, is Grace staying with us again?" Richard smiled faintly. "Yes, son. She's going to stay for a while." "Good." Ethan grinned. "It was boring without her. She tells the best stories." Grace smiled, though her eyes betrayed a quiet sadness. The innocence in Ethan's words twisted something deep in her heart. The truth she and Richard planned to tell him wasn't a simple story, it was one that could change everything he believed about his life. After breakfast, Richard asked Ethan to join them in the living room. The boy ran over, still cheerful, holding his toy car. Grace and Richard sat together on the couch, both looking nervous. "Ethan," Richard began carefully, "there's something we need to tell you." "Something important." The boy looked curious. "Is it about Mom?" The question hit like a soft arrow. Grace looked down, and Richard hesitated, gathering strength. "Yes," he said finally. "It's about your mother and Grace." Ethan frowned slightly, confused. "Grace? What about her?" Richard took a deep breath. "Grace wasn't just our maid. She was your mom's best friend. She helped your mom when she was sick, and she made me promise that we would always take care of each other." Ethan tilted his head. "So, she's like family?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. Very much like family. The boy smiled brightly. Then why didn't you tell me before? Richard looked away. Because I wasn't ready to face it. I made mistakes, Ethan. Big ones. And I didn't want you to see that. Ethan's smile faded. Mistakes? Richard nodded slowly. When your mom was alive, I didn't treat her the way she deserved. We argued. I was angry, busy, selfish. And the night she left us, I didn't know she was carrying another baby. The words hit the air like thunder. Grace's hands trembled as Ethan blinked, trying to understand. Another baby? He whispered. Yes, Richard said softly. You almost had a brother or a sister. Ethan's toy car slipped from his hand and rolled across the floor. The boy looked between them, his face pale. So, you're saying Mom died because of that night? Richard's voice cracked. I don't know, Ethan. But I've blamed myself every day since. The boy was silent for a long moment, his young mind trying to process the adult world that had suddenly opened before him. Finally, he looked at Grace. Did you know? Grace's eyes glistened. Yes. I knew. I tried to protect her, and when she was gone, I tried to protect you. That's why I stayed all these years. Ethan looked down, tears filling his small eyes. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you were too young, Grace whispered. And I was too scared. The boy didn't respond. He got up, picked up his toy car, and walked toward the stairs. I need to be alone, he said softly. Grace tried to follow, but Richard stopped her gently. Let him breathe. He needs time. The house fell into a tense silence. The clock ticked softly, the wind whispering outside. Grace sat on the couch, her heart breaking. Did we do the right thing? She asked quietly. Richard stared into space. There's no right way to tell a child that his world was built on secrets. But at least now, it's built on truth. Hours passed before Ethan finally came back downstairs. His eyes were red, but his face was calm. He stood in front of them, holding something, the golden locket. I found this in your room, Dad, he said. Mom's locket. Richard nodded, his throat tight. Yes, she gave it to Grace before she. Ethan interrupted softly, I think she'd want Grace to have it again. He walked over to Grace and placed the locket in her hand. Mom trusted you. So do I. Grace froze, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ethan. He shook his head and smiled faintly through his tears. It's okay. I'm not mad. I just wish I could have known her. Grace knelt down and hugged him tightly, her voice trembling. She's still with you, Ethan. Every time you smile, every time you're kind, that's her. Richard joined them, wrapping his arms around both of them. For a long moment, the three of them stayed like that, a broken family, slowly healing. But even in that warmth, a shadow lingered. Grace knew the story wasn't fully told. There was still one truth left unspoken, something that even Richard didn't know. Something Anna had whispered to her in the final hours before the accident. And that truth, if revealed, could change everything once again. Because sometimes, the truth isn't what heals, it's what tests how much love can survive. The next few days brought a strange calm to the Carter mansion. The air felt lighter, laughter began to return, and the home that once echoed with silence now carried a fragile peace. Richard worked from home more often, Grace cooked again, and Ethan, though quieter than before, seemed to be slowly finding his way back to joy. But under that peace, something still lingered, a shadow Grace couldn't ignore. Every night, when the house went quiet, she found herself sitting by the window, staring into the dark garden. The sound of crickets filled the air, but her thoughts were loud, too loud. She had promised Anna she would tell Richard everything when the time was right. But was it right now? Could he bear the final piece of truth? One evening, as Grace cleaned the attic to organize the old boxes Anna had left behind, she noticed a small wooden chest tucked behind a stack of dusty furniture. It was covered with a faded blue cloth, the kind Anna used to love. Her heart skipped. She knelt, brushing off the dust, and slowly opened it. Inside were old photo albums, letters, and one sealed envelope with Richard's name written in Anna's familiar, delicate handwriting. Grace's fingers trembled. The envelope had been there all these years, untouched, hidden by Anna herself. For a long time, Grace just stared at it. The temptation to read it burned inside her, but it wasn't hers to open. Finally, she picked it up and went downstairs. Richard was in his study, going through documents. When he saw her, he smiled faintly. "You're still up? It's past midnight." "I found something," she said softly, her voice uncertain. "In the attic. I think it's for you." He frowned and stood, his eyes falling on the envelope in her hands. The handwriting stopped him cold. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against the familiar curves of her name. "Anna," he whispered. Grace nodded. She must have left it there before the accident. "I never saw it before today." Richard sat down heavily, his hands shaking as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter, folded neatly, still carrying the faint scent of lavender, the same perfume Anna always wore. He began to read, his voice barely above a whisper. "My dearest Richard. If you are reading this, it means life had plans that neither of us could control. I know we argued, I know I left angry, but please believe me, I never stopped loving you. The anger was never stronger than the love we built. There is something you need to know, something I couldn't tell you face to face. The baby I carry might not be yours. Before you let anger take over again, listen to me. When you began to drift away, when work, pride, and silence replaced laughter, I was lonely. Weak. And in that weakness, I made a mistake. A man I met during the charity projects, someone kind and understanding, was there when you weren't. It happened only once, and I regretted it every second after. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know whose child it was. But I chose to believe it was yours, because hope, not fear, was the truth I wanted to live in. Please, Richard, forgive me. Don't punish Grace. She only tried to protect what was left of us. If you can, raise our son with love, not guilt. And if you ever learn this truth, remember, we are all more than the worst thing we've done. With all my heart. Anna." The paper slipped from Richard's fingers. His face went pale, his chest heavy as the weight of the words sank in. Grace sat across from him, silent, afraid to breathe. He whispered hoarsely, "The baby wasn't mine?" Grace closed her eyes. She wasn't sure, Richard. She wanted to tell you, but she couldn't bear to lose you completely. He stood, his hands trembling. "So all this time, all my guilt, all my anger, it was built on lies?" "No," Grace said softly. "It was built on love that was broken. You both made mistakes. You both suffered for them." He paced the room, the pain in his eyes sharp as glass. How could she do this? How could she hide this from me? From him? Grace rose slowly. Because she was scared. Because she loved you too much to destroy you. Richard stopped, his voice breaking. "And you knew?" Tears filled her eyes. "Only part of it. She told me the day before she died, that she was afraid the baby might not be yours. But she made me promise never to tell you, not unless you were ready to forgive her." He turned toward the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "And you think I can forgive this?" Grace stepped closer. "If you can forgive yourself, maybe you can." He didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy and raw. The sound of thunder rolled faintly in the distance, echoing like a warning. Finally, he turned, his voice quieter, colder. Does Ethan deserve to know this? Grace froze. He's a child, Richard. This truth could destroy him. He looked away, his jaw tight. Or it could set him free. But his tone wasn't convincing, it was the sound of a man lost between rage and heartbreak. Grace reached out gently, placing her hand over his. Don't make decisions tonight. Not when your heart is burning. Richard didn't pull away, but he didn't look at her either. His eyes stayed on the rain streaking the glass, each drop reflecting the storm inside him. When Grace finally left the room, the letter still lay open on his desk. He stared at it long into the night, replaying every memory, every smile, every argument, until all that was left was a single thought that refused to fade. If Anna's child wasn't mine, then who is he? And with that question, the fragile peace they had built began to crack, piece by piece. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't end the story. It begins a new one that can destroy everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and blood. The next morning dawned pale and uneasy. The mansion was quiet again, too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Richard hadn't slept. He sat in his study all night, staring at Anna's letter until the ink blurred and the words seemed to twist into new shapes. Every sentence replayed in his mind like a cruel whisper, the baby I carry might not be yours. By the time the sun rose, Richard wasn't the same man anymore. The world he had tried to rebuild, his peace, his forgiveness, his fragile hope, all trembled on the edge of collapse. Grace found him at the window, still dressed from the night before, his eyes hollow and distant. You didn't sleep, she said softly. He didn't turn around. How could I? Every memory I ever had is different now. She stepped closer, her voice careful. Richard, you can't let this letter erase everything you know. You raised Ethan. You've loved him. That's what makes you his father. He finally turned to her. But what if I'm not? What if I've been living someone else's lie? Grace's heart clenched. Then you love him because you chose to. Isn't that what being a father really means? Richard didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with a quiet storm. I need to know the truth, Grace. I need to be sure. Her voice shook. You're not thinking about a DNA test, he said flatly. Yes. Grace's expression fell. Richard, please, don't do this. Some truths are better left where they belong, in the past. He shook his head. I can't live with maybe. Not anymore. That afternoon, while Ethan was at school, Richard went to the hospital. He didn't tell Grace. He didn't tell anyone. He handed over a sealed envelope, strands of hair, a small swab sample, his own test kit. The nurse said results would come in a few days. Those days felt like years. Grace noticed the change immediately. Richard avoided eye contact. He was distant, restless, haunted. At dinner, he barely spoke. Ethan, confused and hurt, tried to joke, tried to bring back the laughter, but it only made the silence louder. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Ethan finally asked, Dad, did I do something wrong? Richard froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. No, son. Of course not. Then why do you look at me like that? Grace's eyes filled with tears. Ethan. But Richard interrupted, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm just tired, that's all. The boy nodded slowly, but he didn't believe it. Later that night, as Grace tucked him in, Ethan whispered, I think Dad's mad at me. She brushed his hair gently. No, sweetheart. He's mad at himself. When Grace left the room, she found Richard standing in the hallway, listening. His shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked like a man drowning silently in guilt. 3 days later, the results arrived. The envelope lay on his desk, the same way Anna's letter had. He stared at it for hours, afraid to open it, afraid of the truth it might hold. Finally, he tore it open. His eyes scanned the paper once. Twice. Then he stopped breathing. The words were simple, clinical, undeniable. Probability of paternity, 0%. The paper slipped from his hand. He sank into the chair, the world spinning around him. Ethan, the boy he had raised, loved, fought for, was not his biological son. Grace found him moments later, pale and shaking. Richard? He looked up at her, his voice hollow. It's not mine. He's not mine. She froze. The air went still. No, she whispered. You shouldn't have done this. He laughed bitterly. I needed the truth. Now I have it. Grace stepped closer, her voice trembling. And what will you do with it? Throw away the only person who ever gave your life meaning? I don't know, he said, his hands gripping his head. I don't know anything anymore. She knelt in front of him. Listen to me, Richard. You may not share his blood, but you share his soul. You were there when he took his first steps, when he cried, when he laughed. That's what makes you his father, not a test. He stared at her, eyes burning. But every time I look at him now, I'll see her betrayal. Then see her love too, Grace said softly. Because that boy, that innocent child, is the proof she tried to hold your world together, even when it was falling apart. Richard turned away, tears sliding down his face. I don't know if I can look at him the same. Grace's voice broke. Then don't look with your eyes. Look with your heart. That's the only part of you Anna ever believed in. He stood slowly, the letter still in his hand. Ethan deserves to know. No! Grace cried. You'll destroy him. He's just a boy. He deserves the truth, Richard repeated, his tone colder now, harder. Grace's eyes filled with fear. And if you tell him, what then? You'll break the only bond you have left. He didn't respond. He just walked past her, leaving the room in silence. That night, Grace stood by the doorway to Ethan's room, watching him sleep. The boy's face was peaceful, untouched by the storm that brewed downstairs. She whispered to herself, voice trembling, Anna, if only you'd told him everything before you left. But somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Because now that the truth was out, love alone might not be enough to hold them together. And when morning came, Richard Carter, the millionaire who once had everything, would have to face the hardest question of all. Can a father still love a son who isn't his own?